Hello, everyone. My name is Santis Beatty, and I'm so excited that you have joined us. We are in the midst of a series on just conversations, and we've talked about everything from multi-ethnic worship to homogeneous church strategies to residencies to dealing with two churches in one building, multi-ethnic next gen, and last week we talked about planting multi-ethnic. And so you've come onto a train already in motion. But we're glad you're here. I've been serving as the director of multi-ethnic ministries for the Wesleyan Church for several years now, and just really excited about the fact that this is not just a conversation for the Wesleyan Church. It's a conversation for every denomination and every church and every leader. And so we're excited about the lineup of panelists that we have, some who are Wesleyan, some who are not. We have authors on this panel. We have folks that have served in youth ministry on this panel. We have lead pastors. We have professors, we have a little bit of everything. And so we believe that leaders are learners, and at the point we stop learning is at this point we stop leading. And so we believe this is a vital part of our process, just in terms of not just a conversation. We believe that scripture teaches us that this is not just a diversity issue, but it's actually an issue of discipleship. And so we see that very clearly in the Great Commission. We see it clearly in John 17. But we know the struggle sometimes is, how do you have the conversation, right? It's a conversation we must have, but we need to know how to have it in our context. And so that's part of what today is about, is to give you several different examples of how churches and leaders are having the conversation. And we don't believe that everything that will be shared today will fit your context, but we do believe that there'll be something that will be shared that might be meaningful, that you can take to your particular church or to your particular ministry, and it might be useful. And so with that in mind, I want to introduce to you Josemar Trent, who is going to share a little bit about how you can engage with our panelists, how you can engage in this process through the Q&A and the chat.
Hi, my name is Josemar Trent, and I am the support staff for Church Multiplication and Discipleship, as well as for Multi-Ethnic Ministries. And I am also the translation specialist for this division. But we're so glad that you're here with us today, and we invite you to participate with the chat. At the bottom of your screen, you will see the Q&A button and also the chat button. In there, you can just plug in your questions or your comments to the panelists. And what they will do is, each of them, they will present and they will talk a little bit about themselves. And then after each of them have presented, then we will fill your questions. So make sure that you just type your questions, don't be shy, and ask away.
And so here's something I want to say early on, because when you have like multiple denominations and leaders from all over, like today, you'll notice that I'm going to call the panelists by their first name. And I know for some cultures and denominations that may be disrespectful, but just in terms of an even keel of how we're going to do things, several of the people on this panel have titles and things of that nature that we could easily include, but we're just going to call everybody by their first name, if that's okay. And just wanted you to know that we're not doing that as any form of disrespect, but just as a way of communicating in this context. So with that in mind, I want to start with a couple pastors in the Triad area of North Carolina now. Some of you may know I was in Greensboro for a number of years as a youth pastor, and some of this work was starting to happen, or was happening before I left. And then there's been a lot of work. We've been gone, or we were gone for about 6 years. We've been back for almost a year now, and was able to hear about it and now join some of the work that's happening that Reginald Holliday and Jeff Miller are going to talk about now. And so I want to ask Reginald, if you'll just share a little bit of your story, a little bit of what's going on with what's called the Triad Pastors Partnership, and then we'll go to Jeff Miller, who will share a little bit more about something called Can We Talk?
Appreciate Santis for having us on to talk about what the Lord is doing here in our area. We have been working since 2013, actually since April 2013, simply desiring to build relationships between the pastors in this area. We've labeled them ethnic partnerships on purpose, and as Josemar was saying, we wanted to be very intentional about reaching across racial lines and barriers, and building relationships with leadership, lead pastors, senior leaders within the body of Christ, primarily because, we felt that there could something, potentially happen in our region where the church needed to already be in relationship with one another so we could respond appropriately. And it just so happens that right after our very first meeting, the incident took place in Ferguson, which as we were sitting together around the table and beginning to develop a relationship, that was a real challenge for us as varying views were put out on the table and so forth. But we worked through that, and we've been progressing at a steady pace. We've, developed the mindset that this is going to take some time because we are building trust relationships with one another. But we have pastors who have made a commitment, one black, one white. We've had Hispanic, no Asian pastors yet, but we've had some from the Middle East to make a commitment to meet with one another at least once a month at their own discretion, and just to build a relationship with one another outside of hopefully the church context. And so, we've moved along, as I said, things are growing, relationships are developing. We are making a shift, if you will, as Mark described, to now putting boots on the ground to address some of the social justice needs in our area, some of the economic issues in our area. And so it's all been an outgrowth, if you will, though, of us just trying to get to know one another and realizing that it does take time, and there's some things that we've had to unlearn. There's been some things that we have had to learn in an effort, I think, to increase our cultural intelligence relative to one another. And so it's been exciting. It's been hard work. It's been challenging, and but I think we're headed in the direction that the Lord would have this particular region to go, especially as we see the same thing happening, across our nation and even in other parts of the world.
Reginald, it's been a joy. I've been able to sit in on a few of those meetings and see black and white, male and female, churches from all sorts of denominations being a part of this, and then being able to be a part of what Jeff Miller's going to talk about in just a moment. Mm-hmm. And so thank you for your leadership and just the investment and the hits you've taken, just in terms of leading the way and hosting this at your church each month. But let me share a quick video from Jeff Miller, who's one of the other pastors in the Triad area, who's a part of this partnership. And he's going to kind of introduce himself and share a little bit more of the details of another component of this conversation, which is called Can We Talk?
I'm a pastor at Christ Church, Greensboro. And I want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing, something called Can We Talk? But to back up, I should say that for the last year and a half, I've been a part of this group that you just heard about called the Triad Pastors Partnership. And it's been my privilege to join together with other pastors of predominantly black and predominantly white churches together, sharing our love for God, for the city of Greensboro, and for racial reconciliation. And so we've become really close to that fellowship where we gather together every month for prayer and for discussion. And after being a part of that group for about a year, it seemed to me like it made sense for what we were thinking about as a church to maybe expand that to this group that I was a part of. And so a couple of years before, we had held an event called A Time to Listen. And essentially it was an event at our church to address the issues of race and where we are in our country and where we're going to go with this as a church. What is our role? And so we did that 2 years ago, and it was well attended, had a lot of people from the community, not everybody church going, and a lot of people interested in thinking about that. And so when we evaluated it, when we were done, one of the big takeaways from our leadership was, hey, that was great, but people were all asking, well, what now? What next? Kind of where do we go from here? And so a couple of years went by, and things in our country only increased in terms of the tensions and the need to address issues of race. And so we as a church began to think about doing a second go at this thing. And that's when we came up with this idea of Can We Talk? But this time, applying some of the takeaways from the first go around, I pitched it to my friends at Triad Pastors Partnership and said, hey, what would it look like if instead of one single event, we turn this into a series of events? And it was a collaboration, not simply by one church, but by a group of churches in our community. And so that really led to a completely different feel. And we quickly got together. We created a video in which each of the pastors presented the idea, and we created a Facebook page, and a lot of people were interested. And it just showed us that there was a real need, there was a real hunger for something like this. And so so we began, and basically what we did was we put together a series of 5 events, January through May, 1 a month, and it was called Can We Talk? And right now we've done 3 out of the 5, and it's been really a great blessing. We've seen a lot of attendance from across the community, people coming from a variety of different churches coming together, and I think people are actually kind of, if I can say it, amazed that pastors from different churches are collaborating together in their own community and from very different churches, but uniting in this. And so that's been a beautiful thing to see. The format for each evening is usually we have invited different experts to serve on a panel, and that panel's been anywhere from, say, 4 to 6 people, and they've been comprised of people who are professors at local universities, pastors, authors, and just different types. And there's been a single theme. For example, at our first one, the theme was the state of race in America today. And in the second one, the theme was hidden figures of the faith, February being Black History Month. The emphasis was on the presence of Africans in the Bible and the presence of African Americans in church history. And then just a couple nights ago for March, the theme was race and friendship. And then in April, it's going to be called Black and Blue, What to Do, Law Enforcement and Race. And then in May, we're going to address the subject of what is called colorblind racism. And so again, in each case, we have a panel of about 4 to 6 people, and they each give very, very short TED Talk-like presentations that are about 8 to 10 minutes in length, well prepared. And then following that time, the panel then all comes together on the stage and addresses questions that have come from people beforehand and from a moderator. And in each event, we've had about 200 to 300 people come, and it's been a really rich time. But one of the differences, again, this time was that we decided that we would make sure that we had follow-up opportunities. So we've done 2 additional things besides just the events. And those 2 things are, first, we've done something called Can We Talk Food for Thought? And that's a monthly gathering for lunch where people come bringing their own lunch, but we give a pre-assignment, which is something very accessible. It's usually a click away with a link to an article online or a video on YouTube, or possibly something to read or to listen to. And so that serves as the basis for the discussion that we have when we actually get together at the Food for Thought lunch. And then in addition to that, we've tried to get people who are thinking, I'd love to have conversations about race, but I'm not quite sure where to go, how to start. And so we provided something that we called Can We Talk One-on-One? And that's where somebody will be paired with someone else who is of the same gender, similar life stage, but of a different race. And we have provided the questions to guide them through a series of 4 conversations. And we've tried to be very thoughtful about how we've arranged the discussion questions. We've even dubbed them names for each of the conversations. The first one is called The Beach. The second one is called The Surf. The third one is called The Waves. And the fourth one is called Deep Waters. So you can see that there's a progressive idea, and that there's an issue of building trust and building rapport, building relationship. And so right now we have 40 people who have signed up to participate in the Can We Talk one-on-one experience. And so 20 pairs of people, men and women, who are participating and experiencing the one-on-one conversations. One of the things I would say about all this is that we recognize that there are some people who have been ready for this conversation, have actually been very experienced in having this type of discussion about issues of race. And typically that's people who are of the minority culture, but the majority culture people typically are newer to this type of discussion. So we're trying to acknowledge that there's a range of experience and comfortability and just desire for it. And so we're acknowledging that and trying to strike that balance between pushing advancing the ball, if you will, and just helping people along with this. And so it seems like between the events and the monthly lunches where we provide an opportunity for a discussion and the one-on-one, it's really serving our community well. And I'm sure we're going to do a lot of evaluating when it's done, and we're still evaluating even as we're doing it. But I'm really grateful for what God is doing through this effort, and especially grateful for the fact that this is a collaborative effort on the part of a group of pastors across the community who are linking arms together to bring this about.
So, man, great insights to just what's happening with Triad Pastors Partnership. And I've been able to attend 2 of these Can We Talk sessions. The one that was just had, I guess, last week, was actually out of town and wasn't able to participate, but just a great resource. And Jeff and Reginald are on. And I'd love to just ask one question of you all, and then we're going to go to Elizabeth. And I think it's a question that got asked in the Q&A area. But what do you see as your biggest takeaway? You could either say takeaway or your greatest challenge as you all have worked together to do this in the Triad area and have multiple churches. You have Christians coming, people who are not Christians coming. Like, what's been your biggest takeaway, or what's been your biggest challenge as you've been doing this work?
Yeah, our biggest challenge, especially in terms of just getting pastors together, for many of them, just getting them to see the whole need for the church to come together this way has been a challenge. Pastors, as we all know, are very busy, and some, have even questioned whether or not this is a matter of importance, that, in terms of whether or not this is something that's even legitimate at all. And so that's been one of the challenges. And then I think the other challenge, for us is finding individuals who believe it's a great idea, but then making the time to maintain the commitment to partner with another pastor. And some pastors are bivocational, so they may not be able to actually make the meeting that we have once a month on the 3rd Friday, but we also are just extending to them the opportunity of just partnering with another pastor for the purpose of building that relationship. And so we do have a desire to see those numbers increase, because we think that the more we have these kind of relationships develop, the better our overall witness will be as a church in this area.
One of the things that just seems to come up over and over again is, okay, there are multiple contexts, right? So you have church context, you have denominational context, you have individual context. And Elizabeth is up, and she's going to share a little bit just of her journey and some of the ways she's approaching the conversation from her context.
I'm Elizabeth, and I have a few slides to show you here. We have been, my family and I have been involved in multi-ethnic ministry for some time in different ways. So our kids kind of have grown up in a diverse church environment that's been a blessing to us. We're now at a church of homeless and materially poor folks in Fairfax County, Virginia area. And it has been kind of an experience that has taught us in different ways about multi-ethnic ministry. I teach for several of the Wesleyan universities in intercultural studies and sociology. And the nature of what I teach is ministry in cultural contexts. And so the gist of that is that, churches exist with neighbors, real neighbors that they didn't pick themselves, and they need to be Jesus in those communities, and they need to go the distance to love them. And to include them, and so to draw them into the flourishing that the church can offer. So interestingly, though, the Lord brought these different threads of my life and ministry together in some research I did a few years ago. And I guess that's really what I want to talk about, because it has explained a lot to me. And it has shown me that often the people that we're talking to are for some reason, they're willing to come to the conversation. They're already willing. Some of you mentioned your church ministries, and you're talking to churches that you have some people who are willing there, And you have some people sitting there who are not really willing to be part of the conversation. They don't really want to go there yet. And really what kind of makes up that resistance is sort of what has been interesting to me. And how you get people who are resistant to want to participate. And also just facing the reality that, first of all, we have people who are not ready to participate. Secondly, we have people who come to difficult conversations, and they are willing at the time. People don't enter these difficult conversations with bad intentions, and yet sometimes things happen. Like Reginald mentioned, some of the conversations you're having there. Somebody else mentioned Ferguson. Things happen, and even the most willing people to be in this conversation can hit a point of frustration, or anger, or hurt, or risk, or something, and they want to just step out of it. Or you have good people who they are for a time interested and they drift away. Their attention is captured by something else. They feel the fervor or the passion for reconciliation and multi-ethnic conversations, but they lose interest. The honeymoon is over or something. And so I think sustainability in the conversation is really what I'm really interested in. So this is something that you already get this, and Josmar mentioned something like this too. But this is kind of where I start with people, and I just try to point out with them, and in many ways we talk about this, that we're all creatures ensconced within culture, and culture is one of those funny words that has a giant meaning. It could be like Western culture, which is huge, or we could be talking about like the culture of my home group, and that's like this little tiny thing, and we somehow understand what that is. But we have these spheres of comfort and familiarity where we know the rules. Our preferences are not exactly satisfied necessarily, but we kind of know, we sort of know the landscape, and chances are within our little comfortable zone, our preferences are going to be, acceptably satisfied to some extent, and we know how to have control. We know what those means are. And stepping outside of that, for example, into multi-ethnic conversations is very scary. It's a huge risk. We're vulnerable out there. Inside this little space, we've got a lot of redundancy around our own ego, really. But we have this sort of buffer zone around our ego that's our group, and we're comfortable there. And what I'm kind of ultimately trying to get people to establish sustainability in the conversation is to recognize the personal, the missional, particularly most of all the spiritual benefits of crossing out of that border. And so what I always talk about is border crossing. In my research, I interviewed evangelical university students about their interactions with difference. And so this could be somebody, maybe these people are really staunch Republicans and they're interacting with Democrats, or maybe it's black and white, or maybe it is some other type of divide. How do they navigate that difference? And the conclusion of everything that I found was that the people who show the most promise in having sustainable and successful relationships across a border are, and borders mean anything, right? Age, anything, economics. The people who have the most promise for sustainability and success are the ones who can explain their commitment according to something far deeper. For example, somebody mentioned kind of a preemptive conversation in your community, so that if a Ferguson breaks out in your community, that you've already got relationships established where you can talk to people. That is really important. For that, as far as my research goes, to really be sustainable and protected, you help people tie that to like even something deeper. And so that's something deeper, and the people that I studied, they can explain their commitment to that in terms of their beliefs about God. What does God require of me in this life? And if they can tie that commitment to something they believe about God, it could be following the example of Jesus. It could be, many of them mention the kingdom of God and what our participation in that is. The others are less strong, but beliefs about just existence itself, like about myself. How can I live the best life? And if they believe, because not all the people we're talking to are Christians engaging in this conversation, but the best life that I can have, if they can believe that that is tied somehow to succeeding in this conversation, then it has more sustainability. And then also the last one is just about others, about ethics. So it might be social justice. It might be just interpersonal integrity. It could be tolerance, ideas about tolerance. But that when we are forging these conversations and these difficult things, that we are helping them have the grit to stay with it and succeed, according to beliefs that are rooted far, far deeper. Concern, that I think that the thing that had eluded me always is that everybody has something that I am now calling concern. And it's this sense of like, I should or I ought to either cross that border into something uncomfortable, or I should really stay with my own group and protect what I know. And if you think about it that way, you might see that in people. Everybody has this compelling sense, either to cross borders or not. So I call it border crossing concern when you're willing and have this commitment to cross. So here is really kind of where I think we hit a snag sometimes. What I found was a relationship between skill and concern. And skill is like cultural intelligence. And we often, so we talk about, like, we do diversity training, and everybody, you know, today knows that there is really a difference between what we're talking about and just diversity training. But so much of what is done out there in the world, in banks everywhere, in universities everywhere, people focus on skill. Sometimes we do that too, as Christian leaders. And we want to help people develop their cultural intelligence, which is like a blend of knowledge and behavior and motivation and understanding. But what I found is that for something to be for a person's engagement in that to be sustainable, they really need to strengthen not just their skill, but primarily this idea of border crossing concern that I was talking about, so that the most successful people are way up here in this far corner, where you have high skill and high concern. So that, because you could have a person with all the cultural intelligence skill in the world, maybe they know how to cross cultures, maybe they grew up overseas, okay? But if really at their heart, they don't recognize a spiritual component, a really deep spiritual reason for staying engaged in this process, that surpasses their immediate motivation for doing it, you know, then they're going to hit a wall and it's going to fall apart. So that's just to make it sustainable. So finally, I want to say what this produces. If you have people growing in skill and in border crossing concern, okay, their deep commitment, understanding of why it's so vitally important to my life or to God or to society for me to engage in this, then it shows up in these 4 ways. And they, when they look at people, and this is when I'm training people, I am looking at these 4 things. When you look at other people, are you able to do that with honor? And so then you have to consider, where do my perceptions come from? Who am I letting talk to me about my perceptions of other people? You know, what news do I have on all day long, or whatever that could be clouding my perception? So getting our perceptions right. Always pursuing understanding, not just gaining knowledge, not just like having a seminar to help people understand, but really continually emphasizing the humility of the learner in that. Do we self-regulate? It's like in my marriage, I'm not just motivated to be married to my husband. I have a deep regulator in me that makes me always guard my commitment? So do we have these deep protections in place? And finally, do I have the will to do it? And what are the very, very deep reasons for being faithful in this process and like living out what I really say I believe? So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So with that in mind, I want to move next to two authors of a resource that I have just found as a meaningful, powerful tool over the course of the last several years. And it's called Multiethnic Conversations. And we're going to show you, as a person who's been in kind of a community organizer, been in higher education, I was a youth pastor for about 15 years, and now serving as a denominational leader, you constantly look for resources that you can say to people, man, like, take this, like, this is a great tool for you to use, when I'm gone, when I'm not doing a workshop, or when you're looking for something to bring people together. And this has been one of the best things out there. And so I'm really excited to introduce, some of you already know them, but if you don't know them, Onia and Mark are the authors of this resource. And I just want to give them a few moments to just share why they developed it, just the heart behind it, and just so you know a little bit more about that story.
I think what you said is very true in terms of relationships, that you can't have relationships if you're not willing to listen to one another. The idea behind it was when our church, I'm at People's Church in Cincinnati, Ohio, when we started to diversify, we had all these people in the pews, but they weren't developing relationships. They weren't going deep with each other, because it's not necessarily natural to talk about every element of your life experience that's come from your background. And so we started off with a tool we called the Vision Experience, which was 20 weeks long, designed to people in small groups. And we actually shut down every ministry of our church, all of our small groups, all of our Bible studies, in order to have people go through it together. And the impact was astounding. People were able to start relationships, to talk about things in ways that they'd never done before. We have people in our church today, 10 years on from our first experience, who say they wouldn't have been there still today if they hadn't developed the relationships they developed in those groups. And so we continued to revise our material. And when I met Mark in 2013, we looked at it together and realized that there were some things going on in Little Rock that dovetailed nicely with what was going on in Cincinnati. And so we put our heads together, and that's really how Conversations was born. And I'll let Mark continue on with the story.
It's been a wonderful experience and joy to get to know Onia and her husband Dale, and to work with her over the last several years, and particularly producing this curriculum and other things through the Mosaics Global Network, which aggregates the multi-ethnic church movement, and really beyond that, justice and economic development in communities for the sake of the gospel, since we were founded in 2004 by myself and Dr. George Yancey. So really, Onia said it all. On my side of it, where she was working her curriculum through in her church, I had recognized the need that both in my own writing and writing of others, going back all the way to the mid-90s, virtually all of the books that were encouraging, making the theological case, the practitioner, the practical case for multi-ethnic churches were aimed primarily at leaders. 9 out of 10 books were aimed at leaders. And there was a need to put the cookies on the lower shelf, as it were. So you not only are starting from the top down, but also going from the bottom up to create understanding, theological understanding, best practices, etc. So when I met Onia and my good friend Chris Beard, who literally just left here yesterday, Onia had a wonderful experience, great conference. But Chris told me about Onia and the curriculum that she put together there. I think the convergence was her life experience, her research, her understanding, her communications in terms of confidence and cross-cultural confidence communication. And then I supplemented that with theology and from a pastor's perspective. So I think you got a really stereo effect between her voice and my voice in this book. And then what I knew was that the idea, if you're putting cookies on the lower shelf, it had to be in bite-sized chunks, as it were. And my good friend Hugh Halter and the Missional movement, they had produced a thing called the Primer, the Missional Primer, that was very successful. And that's essentially the format that Onia and I adopted, where you follow a rhythm, there's a weekly theme, and then 7 days, of course, in the week. So every first day of the week is a small lesson on theology. Every second day is a small lesson on history. Every third day is a lesson on some statistics and demographics, and it goes from there, communication, competence. So it follows a rhythm. So in total, after 8 weeks, people have 8 lessons on theology, 8 lessons on history, etc. And the devotions themselves, because you're doing private work in the Word of God and with the Holy Spirit, and then of course you're coming together collectively at the end of a week or 2 weeks, whatever your rhythm is, and discussing those things that you wrote down. So I don't think there's a devotional that's more than 200 words tops. So it's a very quick read to get the juices flowing, so to speak. And then Oni and I always ask a question or two at the end of each of those devotionals, and that's for you to work through. And of course, that then becomes the food for fodder in the small group down the road. Santees and the Wesleyan Church have absolutely just taken this curriculum and made it their own. And we're so thankful for that. In fact, Oni and I published it for almost 3 years through Mosaic's Global Network, self-published, and several thousand copies. Oni, I don't remember how many exactly, but somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 copies were probably produced and sold in those 2 or 3 years, just by our contacts. Churches using them to plant churches. They'll take their core teams through the curriculum. It establishes a baseline of understanding, and then as they unfold new members over time, they do it. Churches like Mark Hearn in Atlanta have taken existing homogeneous churches and transitioned their entire church by doing, I think Mark has done maybe 9 to 11 or 10 or 11 groups, just saturated his entire church. Mega Church is buying. Now, I literally put the curriculum in the hands of the small groups pastor at Saddleback just 3 days ago at Catalyst. And they are going to look at it for their entire Saddleback campus. He actually is a Korean American, and he's now over small groups. And so it's absolutely an astounding curriculum, not just because we wrote it, but it brings together, again, the elements of theology and history along, with cross-cultural communication and competence issues. And it really, again, gives a good stereo effect. It jumpstarts the conversation. This is the last thing I'll say, is the way that I kind of share about it in terms of with people is, if we were going to have a conversation on race, and let's say Nia and I were going to have a conversation, I go, Nia, hey, let's go out for coffee, and man, help me understand some things. So here's the question I say to people, like, where would we start? I mean, would we start with slavery? Would we start with with civil rights movement? Would we start with Black Lives Matter, Trayvon Martin? Where would we actually begin that conversation? And think about it. How long would it take, and how up and down and over hill and mountain and in the valley, how long would that conversation take for us to actually gain some traction, particularly me as a white man, to gain some measurable traction and understanding as I listen and try to learn? How many of those conversations would you have? And would it even be biblical? Would it even be Christ-centered? I mean, who knows, right? So what this does is it truncates the entire conversation into 8 weeks. Now, obviously, we're not going to solve all the world's problems in 8 weeks, right? But it does bring together strong theology. I like to think about it as Christ-centered inclusion training, and it kind of gives you the questions, not so much the answers, but it gives you the questions in a palatable way, and people actually make measurable progress at the end of 8 weeks. So both on a biblical side as well as the social and collective side of things. So all that's to say is that I'll wrap up there. I just want to say this though. I led a con with Catalyst this year, both in Atlanta, and I was just on the West Coast. Catalyst made their entire theme Uncommon Fellowship, which was essentially all about this and the convergence of multi-ethnic ministry, social justice, etc., which we promote through Mosaics in a book called Disruption. But I was just with Sung Cha Ra, Propaganda, Tasha Morrison from the IP conference, and I led a conversation again on race for Catalyst West just several days ago. We did the same thing in Atlanta. Here's my point. When we took the stage, I said on behalf of the 4 of us on stage, we are sick and tired of having a conversation about race. And this idea of conversation is such a buzzword. And I get it, but we had to make sure people understood, particularly white people in the audience, it's not so much a conversation that's two-way. It's the idea And you know, it's that particularly white people, although everybody has to listen, but particularly white culture has to posture themselves in humility to learn and to listen in these conversations. And then beyond that, all of us, white, black, Asian, Hispanic, whatever, it's long past time to start having conversations about race and embracing people beyond the distinctions of this world that otherwise divide, and actually make measurable progress by planting, growing, or developing healthy multi-ethnic churches that are advancing social justice and financial or economic development in urban spaces, particularly to advance a credible witness in an increasingly diverse society. So I think as movement leaders in your own sphere, in your own space, along with what I'm doing, we have to put, it's kind of like every now and then you've got to shift gears when you're driving a car. And we've kind of been, this is just kind of an observation, but it's kind of like since, you know, Trayvon Martin and some of the things that kind of jump-started Black Lives Matter and kind of, if you will, a new civil rights era, we've kind of been in gear 1 and gear 2 around the country on conversation. I think there's a moment right now to put the pedal to the metal and shift up to gear 3 or even 4 and actually start holding people accountable for what they've heard and what they've learned, and actually, particularly in local churches, start making it happen beyond the mere conversation. So I think it's a time that we can shift into third gear and get, you know, building on the conversation the last 2 or 3 years. Let's start making some measurable progress and shift up into the third or fourth gear in the local churches.
Thank you, Mark and Onia. Man, I think part of what I hear you saying that's so vital to this is there's steps, right? Like every time we have this conversation, or every time we start to build on where a church is and where they would like to go, there are always these natural steps. And so having the conversation is always one of the steps. But something we should always be thinking about is, okay, what do we do with what we've learned, right? And I love the fact that at the end of the resource, there are some practical steps like living a multi-ethnic life. Like, what does that mean? How does that play out? And then I think some of what hopefully we'll get to as we talk a little bit more is how some of the folks who are part of the panel are taking it to the next level, right? So, okay, we have the conversation. So what do we do now with what we've learned from each other? What do we do with the systemic oppression and the different things in our community that are the voices of what we're trying to address? So very, very key to this thing. And I think the other piece is what you mentioned too, is that this is sound theology, right? This is not just diversity training. Like, this is something we see very clearly as a biblical mandate, but not just as a mandate, but as a lifestyle of the early church. We see it in Antioch, we see it throughout the scriptures. And so I hope that will be kind of a baseline. So what we want to do next is give you a few examples of churches who've used this resource. So that's kind of what's going to happen. These next few panelists are going to talk about their experience with the resource. Like, we've been using it as a denomination. I got wind of this, I think, pretty early on in you all's process of writing when we were doing some things with Leadership Network together. And so got a hold of it and started using it at our church. We had a couple groups go through it. I then came on staff at the Wesleyan Church headquarters. We took a couple groups through it, about maybe 2 or 3 groups through it, about 40 people. And then we realized, like, we were starting to get people calling and saying, like, we can't drive to headquarters for this, like, for an hour and then get back to our jobs. Like, is there some way you can offer it virtually? And so our next step was, okay, what if we created some type of platform where we could get people on like this, where they can be in their homes, they can be in their offices, they can maybe even have their teams on, and we can go through that. And so we've had about 120 people. We just finished 2 cohorts last week. We had about 120 people go through this. About 20 of those were not Wesleyan, and about 100 or so were. And that's kind of how we've been using it the last several years. And from that, from actually some of those conversations at the end of the conversation, or those 10 weeks for us, was, okay, what do we do? And several of the groups said, why don't you have, instead of having 10 weeks focused on this, why don't you have some very specific conversations or webinars? And that's where these webinars grew out of. They actually grew out of multi-ethnic conversations cohorts and some of the things that happened in that last day. So with that in mind, I want to just shift gears and go to Bo Hamner, who's up in the Marion, Indiana area at College Wesleyan. I want you to just share maybe a little bit of your story, Bo. Bo was actually in one of our cohorts. Him and Dana were in the same cohort. And just share just a little bit of your story and how you guys have used the resource and what you've learned from that.
The resources has been good, but just kind of give you a little bit of my background. Served as a pastor of a very diverse church in Austin, Texas, called Church Under the Bridge. And while there, just really learned to value and love diversity in multi-ethnic churches. And then God had me move to Marion, Indiana, to College Church, and all of a sudden, everyone in the sanctuary looks like me, has had similar experiences as me. And as the outreach pastor, we were doing ministry in the community with individuals that looked, that didn't reflect who our church was on Sunday. And went down to Mosaics there in Dallas in November, and was leaving to come home and realized, I don't know if I want to go back. I don't know if I can do this. And shot Santis an email and came back and sat down with our executive leadership and said, you know, this is the direction that I believe we need to go. And both of them recognized it was something that we needed to do. So as a first step, we've decided to actually take individuals in our church through the multi-ethnic conversations training. And we weren't quite sure how to do that. We knew we couldn't open it up to every person in the church because we don't have enough diversity to make those conversations relevant if we were just to say everyone can be a part of this. And so we had people start to sign up, and you know, we thought we'd get 30, maybe 40 people that said, hey, we want to be a part of this. And the number kept going up and up and up. And what we realized is right off the bat, we were have to be intentional about asking those who were non-white to actually lead some of these conversations. And so we began going to people and, you know, and asking, hey, will you lead a group through this discussion? And it was kind of uncomfortable for a lot of people because they didn't want to be a token minority. We had enough people though that said, hey, this is my church. I'm willing to be uncomfortable. I'm willing to wrestle through this with others. So I'm on board. And so we started off, we're in week 5 now. Santis came up and kind of kicked off the first week and kind of gave us an overview of what to expect and what to get ready for. And it's been challenging for the congregation. We are in a community that has a lot of racial history. We are a church that sits right off the college campus. So very highly educated church. And people a lot of times think they have everything figured out because they have a few degrees and a few titles in front of their name. And so we've been wrestling through this, and it's been really good to have a safe environment to have really hard conversations. Individuals who generally are white, thinking that they have had missional experiences or cross-cultural experiences and thinking that they had arrived at an understanding of what others to go through, only to hear from people within our own church that are from a different cultural background share that your experience is not my experience. And because we care about each other, because the person that has that different experience is somebody we love, it's allowed us to kind of, okay, maybe my understanding, my thought is not everyone's reality. And so we've had these conversations, and we're starting to see how the lessons in the book are actually making their way into the sermons. I mean, Pastor Steve has been a part of the classes, and he is now asking questions and then presenting that to the church as a whole. And so it's shaping who we are. The downside is I realized, man, we have a long ways to go. We're a church that is over 130 years old, and we've gotten pretty comfortable. And so this is kind of revealing that to us. It's gonna take a while. We're gonna have to really be intentional about this, but just this past Wednesday night, as we were wrapping up, I had an individual, a white individual, come up to me and say, hopefully this is not going to be the end. Hopefully you guys are planning what's next. And that was an encouragement to me, that even though people are having a hard time and wrestling with some of this, they don't want it to stop. And so it's gaining momentum. We're seeing more and more people that are willing to say, I'm not okay with just being comfortable. I want to live out the entire gospel. And so it's been really good to see.
To be a part of you all's launch in this and see like what I would consider one of our flagship churches, if you will, in the denomination, take on this resource and begin to create a strategy for building, creating some common language, creating some common experiences, and digging beneath the surface is huge. And I think every church has to start somewhere. Maybe for some, it's a resource like this. Maybe it's something like what Dana just mentioned. But I think all of us have to start somewhere and kind of self-assess where we are, where we need to begin, and then begin to track like what are the next steps after that. Because anytime you deal with something like this, there's always going to be that question that someone asks, okay, what's next? Like, what do we do? How do we use this? And so that's a vital part of the process. So thank you so much for sharing that. We're going to move to our next panelist, and he's actually on this webinar, but also pre-recorded a video that I want to share real quickly. And then.
Hi, Paul Tillman here. I'm the pastor of Oakdale Wesleyan Church in Oakdale, Minnesota, just outside of St. Paul. About 2 years ago, we were, even at our small size of under 50 people, a multi-ethnic church. But that wasn't done with any intentionality. We just happened to have two families that were immigrant families. We had, with the exception of me, another African-American family, and like my family, several couples that were mixed ethnic marriages. And that just happened to be who was at the church and had decided to come here. We're no longer a multi-ethnic church, not for any intentional reason other than natural transitions. Certain people moved away, and when you're a small sized church, if you lose certain families, all of a sudden you're now below that threshold. And so we needed to take a more intentional approach about approaching multi-ethnic ministries, and one way we decided to do that was to use the multi-ethnic conversations. I had gone through the book when it was called the Primer with the denomination, and then planned to introduce that to our Bible studies in small groups to use in that format with the adults. The opportunity came up when one of our teen youth leaders approached me about wanting some new material to go through in youth group. So I offered them the Primer, and what I did is I simply gave them the books one evening, and I said, take a look and see if this is something that you'd be interested in doing. And I left them alone with the material, and they probably spent at least a half hour to 45 minutes just perusing the books, and they came back to me and they said yes, they wanted to do this. So they took some ownership in doing that. Even so, they still had a hard time doing the daily readings. They admitted to me that sometimes they're cramming, before the discussions, but I think that's kind of typical for teenagers. So some of the insights that I've seen as they're going through the material, and this is not a multi-ethnic youth group, predominantly white. These are Generation Z students, and they already have friendships that are outside their own ethnicity and culture. So that was a very natural thing for them, but the material allowed them to dig deeper as to why that's important and what different groups might experience in our culture. One thing that I found was necessary that I wasn't aware of until we started the material is the historical context. These students didn't grow up experiencing O.J. Simpson and stuff like that are referenced in the material. And so they actually needed an older person as part of their discussion to bring the history to them as somebody who went through it so they could understand. So they're about halfway through the material. They've enjoyed it. They are learning. And even as I'm going through it again with them, I'm learning again. So it's good to go through more than once. So that's how we're using it with our youth group. And as we're looking to grow our church, not just for now, but for the next generation, and we think multi-ethnic conversations will be a good tool for that.
All right, so that gives you an idea of just one way that it's been used. We've learned about it from Bo and his context in a predominantly white church, fairly large church, and now with Paul in Oakdale with a youth group. And so Paul is on. Paul, would there be anything you'd share in addition to what you just spoke about in the video as it relates to Oakdale's journey? That was probably 2 weeks ago that you did the video. So they're probably in week 7 or so now, but anything you would share?
Just to maybe emphasize a little more, what they are getting out of this is not the idea of what does it mean to live a multi-ethnic life, but to understand the society in which they live. They're getting out of their culture, their very small culture that they know from their family and maybe from their church, and seeing the broader context. That's probably the biggest thing they're getting out of it. And I think what's really necessary for a next step is to actually have this conversation multi-generationally in our church. And I think that'll be beneficial not only for the youth, but also for all the generations. So that's going to be where we're going from there.
Thank you, Paul. Like, having been a youth pastor for much of my ministerial life, man, to hear you all do this. And one of the things that Onia says, she's not on anymore, she had to dip out, but one of the things she said before is she's often taken an approach of, instead of having them do the daily devotional, she would do kind of an overview of a teaching, or almost like a Bible study around the key points of each day, and then have the conversation. But I think with different groups, you may have to take different approaches. And so that's one of the things that I've tried to do when we've done it with a youth group is to do a little bit of the teaching initially, where you might incorporate some of the things you just mentioned in terms of the historical context, things of that nature. But every group is different, and so you have to kind of figure out what works for your group. But really appreciate you including that. I think some of that might also be true with young adults or emerging adults and college age. But what I've found, and one of the things that we're working on, is to make sure that these conversations are not just limited to those who are over 30. Like, we need to include Generation Z, we need to include millennials in this conversation as much as we can. And so, man, thank you for your leadership and how you're doing that at Oakdale. So, hey, we want to move to our next panelist. You heard from her earlier, and she has been through probably, 8 of these, at least 8 of them with the leadership cohorts we've been doing virtually. And so Josemar, I invited her to come and just share a little bit of, particularly as someone who is not a U.S. citizen in terms of born in the U.S. She's a U.S. citizen, but not born here, is from Venezuela, is bilingual, is bicultural in many ways. And so coming into a conversation like this, new to the denomination, things of that nature, I wanted to hear from her perspective. But Josemar, why don't you share a little bit of takeaways for you from this resource and what you've learned?
Yes, well, like he said, I'm from Venezuela, and I just came here to the United States because I met my husband, and he's American, so I just got married and I came here. So of course, my learning, or what I knew from the United States and Americans, was only by books. Okay, so I learned that you like hamburgers, and I learned all this stuff. Until I came here, I was able to experience some of the other things, and one of the things in the book, it says that cross-cultural competence is more caught than taught. So I can learn a lot by the book, but I am also going to learn much more by being with you, learning from you. So coming from that perspective, and participating in so many of these conversations in the book, one thing that talks to me especially is that we must be willing to get out of our comfort zone to meet others. We need to, like, I work here at headquarters and I meet a lot of people, but then sometimes after I'm done with work and talking to so many people, I don't want to keep talking. I have to take a step out and be able to reach, because I'm not doing church here at headquarters, I have to also work out of my walls here and in CMAT, the headquarters. And the other thing is that each time that I participate on the multi-ethnic conversations, if you see my book, I'm always taking notes. The book always speaks to me in different ways. And the way that spoke to me the most in this time is that we want to build relationships. We want to talk to people. We want to make sure that they know that we're listening to them, but we actually have to actively and intentionally listen. We cannot be listening and creating a little story in the back of our heads, already creating a history of what they're saying. We need to be present, listen, and that way we can listen to little things that they're gonna say to us. You know, like for example, in our team in church multiplication and discipleship, once a week, I try to send them words in Spanish, so that way whenever a Hispanic pastor comes or whenever they have to go to a church and they see a Hispanic person, they say at least, Dios los bendiga, hola, ¿cómo estás? Buenos días. Those little words, at least that's the only thing you know, it means so much to them. You know, and they will get so excited. Try it like if you go to a restaurant or something. They just get excited that you know a few words. So just being intentional is the main goal that always speaks to me. Go take a little extra step, you know, and listen intentionally. Not just to, because when you listen, only my way is not the way of doing things. And I was giving my friends an example, like I can peel an orange with a fork. You know, there are so many different ways. You can use a knife, but I can use a fork to do that. And just know that your way is not the only way to do things. You can learn from so many options, from so many people. You can learn different ways. And that is the worldview that is going to change your lenses, and you can see it from other angles. Like I'm going to learn so much from Santis because he has a culture that I don't know, and I can grab so much from him. So just be able to, just be open to listen, just be open to be intentional about sharing with others, and take time to build relationships, because a multi-ethnic relationship takes so much time. You cannot rush it. You cannot say, well, I want to share just this and this, just the 5 more important things about you, and I'm going to know everything about you. There are going to be so many ways to learn from you, but you have to be open. You have to, what Mark was saying, to be humble and let others teach you that too. And of course, know that the main goal about building relationships is that you build a trust, but don't let the trust be the motive. Be the love for others, be the motive that moves you to have relationship. Eventually, the main goal, the ultimate goal, is to have trust with them, because you want to create a relationship, but you can have an open space to be safe, you know, to bring your problems, like, hey, this is what's happening, this is what I'm thinking, and then be able to open with that person, so that way they can help you, like, no, you're just thinking too much of this, or you should be looking at this. So just do that, and just be present with the person. And the last thing that I wanted to say is all of these conversations have helped me here at headquarters, because pastors out there, when they call, sometimes they're frustrated, and I'm able to listen to them. I'm able to, like for example, one time this pastor called, and the conversation that this pastor was telling me had nothing to do with my department. Yet I'd listen because that person was frustrated, and then I'm like, okay, what about this? And what about this? So you help them think through things. And I was able to help the pastor figure out a way that, you know, they can talk to the department or stuff like that. So just letting them know that we're here, you know, that we care for them. It's not like, you know, when I was in college, and I love dictionaries and all that, is like a thing for me. So I will think of the Oxford people that put the words into the dictionary like they are, you know, untouchable, that they're this, until sometime one day to my college, somebody came from just the Spanish dictionary, and I'm like, oh, there are people that are just like me. So sometimes it is nice for them to know that we are just humans, you know, that we are just Christians who happen to be working here, but that they just can relate to us. And I think now that we're doing translation for the pastors and we're offering everything, I mean, as much as we can in Spanish for them, they can see how much we care about them, and it means so much for them. So I think intentionality has really helped me through this multi-ethnic conversations, and then just love them where they are and love them for who they are and understand where they come from.
Thank you, Josmar. You know, I think part of what you're sharing that has been my experience is that it is an ongoing process. Like, you never fully arrive. Like, you get better. You know, your cross-cultural competence increases, but there are always groups of people that you need to be willing to listen more and remove agendas and be present with, so that you can better understand. And so, having been doing this work for over 20 years, it would be real easy to get into a habit of feeling like I've arrived, right? But the more I do this work, the more groups I'm in like these, particularly these cohorts, the more I realize I don't know, right? The more I realize I need to learn and listen better and do some more research and put myself in situations where my language is not the dominant language, my culture is not the dominant culture. My experience is not the dominant experience. And the more I do that, the more the cultural intelligence increases, but it also allows me to see how much more I need to learn. So the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. But I think it's helpful. It's helpful to be able to be willing to sit with people and hear where they are and not try to change them to be like me, but to be able to affirm their experience for what it is and value that for what it is. So thank you, Josmar, Paul, and Bo for sharing a little bit about the resource. Our next panelist, she's a dear friend of mine. We did youth ministry together for many years when I was in Greensboro, and she just had an event on Fridays, very fresh. And so as someone that knows the work that she's been doing, not just in that context, but in other areas, I wanted her to be a part of this panel because there are books that we can read, there are resources we could pursue, but she's taking a different approach. And I want Dana, why don't you just introduce yourself, Dana, and share a little bit of your story and what happened on Friday and some of the other things that you're doing along the lines of these kind of conversations.
My name is Dana Carr. I'm in Greensboro, North Carolina. I'm on staff with a missions agency called In Faith that focuses in the United States. And I'm also a member at Grace Community Church, which is involved in some of the other efforts that we're going to hear about today as well. But I've been working in urban youth ministry and community development for the last 12 years or so. So live in an under-resourced community here in Greensboro, and it's pretty ethnically diverse. I heard recently we have 22 languages spoken in our neighborhood of only about 2,000 households. So we've got quite a spectrum of folks who live here, and so that's been a real joy. So what we did Friday, and even before that, when CNT sent me the information about this particular webinar, I was excited by the idea of strategies, because I'm a doer and love to find specific ways that we can move into this work. And so several months ago, when Netflix released the documentary 13th, I was it was just incredible, right? Like, I was very engaged in it. Lots of conversation in our community and just really across the country of folks who found that to give voice to some issues in a very clear way. And so immediately I thought, gosh, it would be great to be able to show this to our church, to be able to have a group of people come together. But when you try to do that by the book, you start to run into issues of paying royalties for showings and that sort of thing. And so many churches have licensure to be able to show films, but Netflix isn't covered in that. And so thankfully, within the month of March, they opened 13th up to public showing at no fee. So church groups, schools, any of those sort of organizations, so long as they're doing it not for profit, can show the film to any size group. And so we held a showing Friday night as a space to come together, watch this documentary in community, and then respond to it in discussion. what I've found in a lot of these conversations is we tend to come together to talk about multi-ethnicity, to talk about racial reconciliation, and we talk about our own experiences, right? Which is helpful and is a good starting point. But at some point, it's limited to the experience of those people in the room, right? And we all acknowledge that every white person doesn't have the same communal experience, right? And every African American doesn't have the same communal experience. And so to be able to have different voices to hear and to respond to is very helpful. And so we held the showing Friday night. We had a multi-generational group. So I had folks as young as 18 and 19 that were in college, all the way up to folks who are around 60 who came to view the film. We probably had maybe 40% African American, 60% white audience. And about half the group had seen the film before and half the group hadn't. And so it was a really beautiful mix of folks in terms of experience and background to come together and watch it. Afterwards, we had discussion groups. And so there are a lot of great discussion resources that are already available. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel to really push into some of the topics. And 13th, I didn't mention this, if you haven't watched the film, it centers around mass incarceration, right, which has heavy roots in systemic racism and political systems as well. And so it was great to be able to push into that and have, again, not at the end of the movie to say, so what did you think, right? And just have those reactions, but to be able to really push into specifics. When you hear these specific statistics, how do you see your role in that, right? How have you benefited from these systems, and what does it look like to back out of these systems and no longer support or benefit from them, even if that means it's at personal cost, right? And so when you have a 60-year-old white woman and then a 35-year-old African American man sit and discuss those things, you get widely different responses, right? But when we're in a small setting and get to sit and hear each other, there's a deeper level of understanding and connection that happens. And so it's a really beautiful time. It was especially beneficial, I think, for our college students who were in attendance, because so many times our college kids are really just tiptoeing into this conversation, right? We look at kids that are coming up and say, oh, they're so much further down this road than we are. And in some ways they are, right? In that they tend to have more diverse friend groups, but they still haven't had these conversations. And so the multi-generational aspect in particular, I think, was a real gift to this group, because our college students just got to sit and soak it in. They had a few things to say, but for the most part, they really valued the voice of the older or more mature folks in the group. And so that was a real gift. Other efforts that we've done, I recently had a book study with a group of folks where we read Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. And so again, kind of centering around systems and how race plays into that. And so Brian Stevenson is a lawyer who focuses on death row inmates who have been wrongly convicted, and is an amazing storyteller. And so as we had groups, again, we had folks from probably 25 up to about 60 who joined into that. When you throw out a book club, you have a lot of people who are on board with book clubs, right? And so to make that a meaningful experience, where we're not just, you know, any book is good, right? We want to plug into literature, but when there's a deeper heart under that of pushing into people's experience, it can be a really great thing. And so for the book club, we did an evening in-person study that was here in Greensboro, where folks could come together in one of the members' homes. And then we did a daytime through Zoom, just like we're doing this. And so that opened it up for folks wherever they are, right? If they're on their lunch break, they don't have to worry about travel time. They could just jump right in and do it from work. And so that study was really helpful. I mean, we had one lady in the study who grew up in Southern North Carolina and used to get gas at a place where one of the leaders in the Klan worked, right? And that was so ingrained in her family history. And so she went home, and this is a lady who's probably 55. She went home and her aunt saw the book that she was reading and said, well, why would you want to read that? when she told her about it. And it started to open doors to conversations within her family that other things wouldn't have, right? And so I also will briefly speak to neither 13th or Just Mercy are explicitly Christian books or movies, right? They're secular pieces of work, but I'll say first, I think that really gives you a broader platform to invite folks in, right? And that we're not just having these conversations in a Christian context. It was great at the end of our 13th discussion to be able to end that with saying, okay, let's push in a little bit more into what Christ would say in response to this, right? How one of the questions in our discussion guide was, do you feel any sense of hope after watching this? And it can feel tough to, it can be tough to feel hopeful. But when we look at what Christ calls us to, there's a sense of hope present, right? And so we get to offer that. So I'll end there and say those are very specific strategies, but they've been incredibly helpful in providing a platform for conversation, right? For folks who might feel a little leery about coming to a conversation that's just about multi-ethnicity or just about any of those specific things. It was kind of a softer entry, an on-ramp into this discussion where they had a way to think about things, to talk about things, to enter into relationship. And it's really proved to be a springboard for many of the folks in those groups.
Thank you so much, Dana. You know, part of what I think you're getting at that I think is vital to this conversation is, like, with more conversation comes increased comprehension, right? Like, the more we're able to have conversations, the more we're able to comprehend about others and about their history, their story, their culture. And, you know, there's something about food and music that I think all of us respond to, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's an entry point in a lot of ways. But I think part of what you're getting at is how do we get beyond some of those things into some deeper, beneath the surface kinds of relationships? Because it's really about relationships. And it's very hard to have relationships if we're not willing to listen to each other and hear each other's stories. So, man, thank you for being a part. I know you're going to be on for a little bit longer, but you have to dip out in just a moment. But thank you for sharing that. And I think the context of using a secular resource, whether it be a movie, a documentary, or a book, is a great idea, particularly if you want to bring in voices that would not normally be in a Christian context. So thank you for being a part of this. I want to just offer a couple questions, but one of the questions I already posed, and Reginald responded to it. And Jeff, if you want to do it live, feel free to do it live, or I can go to the video. But the first question is, like, as you've looked at your journey in this conversation, whether you've been leading it personally or in the context of your ministry or your family or you know, in the classroom, like, what's been your greatest challenge? Like, what's been your biggest obstacle as you've led from that place?
So I would say for me, you know, the biggest challenge is something I alluded to before, and that is that you can have the same message that you're sending, whether it's at an event like what we've done with Can We Talk, or any conversation, but particularly when it's a group of just trying to figure out, okay, at the same time, I'm either preaching this sermon or we're having this event, I have some people who are feeling as though, oh, I've heard this before, I wish that we could just go a little harder. Can't we address this issue or that issue? And then on the other end, I've got people who are saying, why are we having this conversation? This is very uncomfortable, and just trying to figure out what's the right target to try to aim for. And then also just how to bring everybody along who's across that spectrum. And so that's a challenge, but you know, the beautiful thing is I honestly would say in our experience that it's been far more of a blessing. I've been more encouraged than I've felt challenged. I've been surprised. I've been hugely blessed to see a group of pastors and a group of churches and people from all these congregations that are realizing, hey, we're not the only ones that are thinking about this. There are people across town that share my city who care about these things. And the biggest takeaway for me has been that people are invigorated, that there are others who are interested in having this kind of conversation. And to me, it has been much more encouraging than it has been challenging.
I think for me, people don't answer the most basic question first. And so they find themselves in a conversation about something that they really can't, when it gets difficult, they really don't know why they should bother at a certain point. And so that's why I think like answering the really deeper questions early and repetitively is so important.
So let me go to another question that just came in, and that is the question, which I think at some level Onia and Mark tried to address in text, but I think it might be appropriate to ask this question live. Like, what do you do when you have a very monoethnic church, right, or a very monoethnic group? And this person was specifically asking, like, what do you do when the group is all white, right? Like, how do you bring in other voices, or what do you do? Can you even have the conversation, I think is what they were getting at, if the group is all white or all Black or all Hispanic? Like, what would be your response to that question?
I would say that it's got to begin with us individually, what we believe, and then coming from what we believe, what we actually practice. I believe Bo was speaking to this earlier, and that as we pursue relationships ourselves, then that becomes apparent. I think there's simply a leadership principle that as people see the things that we're trying to convey in our own lives, and then it becomes something of interest to them. And as we lead by example, then others are begin to say, this is something I ought to be paying attention to and thinking about myself. I would say, in our experience in the Piedmont Triad in North Carolina, I've been so blessed by the opportunity to gather together with other pastors, and Reginald Holliday's leadership bringing us together has been super. And so he's emphasized for us these ethnic partnerships, and so we've enjoyed those. And then as I begin to speak about those to others, they get intrigued and they kind of say, I don't have anything like that. I would like to have that kind of relationship. And so our example is huge. And so I think when we start in my context is predominantly white. It's not exclusively, or it's not a totally monolithic or homogenous setting, but as I begin to step out, as others in our leadership begin to do that, as we participate in something like this, and those who are in our congregation, the few, as they are encouraged, then we begin to see, some progress and some openness and some interest. And so I think you got to start small. You got to start with yourself and the network that God has given you.
I also think about, the old adage that ignorance is bliss, I like to get churches and groups out into the community to actually see things that they, you especially if you have a church where the community has changed and now people are driving in from a distance. There are some activities that can get them out into the community to see with fresh eyes. And sometimes that very act is a game changer, because they never really looked at the neighborhood right around the church. They just drove in the one way they always go, and they leave right after church.
Yeah, I think another thing I would add to that question is, it's possible. You can do it. It's limiting, when you don't have a diverse crowd, but every group is different, right? So some things that happen in one cohort that we've done doesn't happen in another because of who's in the room. And so there's some things you can't control, but then there's some things that you can. And so what I've said to folks before, like I've done this with an all Black group, I've done it with predominantly Hispanic and Native. Like, you can bring other voices into the group through video, through articles that people read, or chapters of books that people read. You can invite a speaker into a particular session to say, look, you're not a part of this group, but we would love for you to be a part of the conversation, and just kind of present for about 10 minutes on this topic before we have the conversation. So there are creative ways you can bring other voices in, even if your group that's going through the conversation over the course of however many weeks you do it, even if there's not diversity in the group. But I think even if you don't have that at all, like even if you don't have the voices at all, resources like this are huge, because there's a lot of self-awareness that comes just by you going through it yourself. Like, it was designed to be used in 3 different ways. For example, the multi-ethnic conversations thing that we just mentioned, you could use it as a personal devotion, you could use it as a group study, you could use it as a sermon series. And so that's one example of how one resource could be used multiple ways, and you can do it in a way that fits your context. And something Jeff did, if you don't mind, Jeff, I want to show this video of how you responded to a question that just came in, and then I want to give other people a chance to respond to the question. But somebody just asked basically, like, how do you get started? And this is how you responded to the question when I asked you this a little while ago.
I think you hit it right there, and that is that it's got to be born out of community and relationship from the get-go. If that's what we aspire for, the people who participate and the people who attend, then we first have to experience it ourselves. And so I think the fact that we've been meeting together for, in my case, for a year and a half, for others longer than that, and that we've been meeting together for the purpose of prayer and for discussion, then we've created a community already, and we're simply trying to extend what we're experiencing. I heard years ago that if you really want to get to know people, you won't get to know them in a small group or a Bible study unless you do a few things. And I thought this was really true still for adults. It's still true almost anywhere. And that is, once you get to do one of these three things with people, then the relationship is kind of stalled. And that is, until you get to eat with people or work with people or play with people, that relationship is going to just kind of reach a certain threshold, and you want to go beyond that. And those things, if you're intentional and deliberate about that, will help you experience deeper community. And so we've had some of that, particularly working together, praying together. And a lot of times guys are just getting together for meals. And so we're experiencing community first before we're then trying to reach out and extend that to our larger community. So that'd be the first thing, I would say. And then I think it's just an issue of, once you have that kind of rapport and that kind of community, then it's just a matter of, hey, let's just think through this thing together. And how do you guys feel about this? How do you feel about that? And we've arrived on some good decisions. Maybe some other things that aren't, stated but should be, is that we've tried to be deliberate about having diversity, not only in this group of Triad Pastors Partnership, but also at the events, and in and where the events are being held. For example, what's the makeup of the panel? And so we've tried to have a diverse panel to include both men and women, black and white. And while we're open to, obviously, questions about other races as well, that's the predominant issue for us, is black and white. So we've tried to be deliberate about having a diverse panel. We've also tried to be deliberate about where the events are taking place. So we have, intentionally alternated between churches that are predominantly white and churches that are predominantly black. And so we know that if we were to simply go one way or the other, either with respect to the panel or with respect to the host site, that would probably have an impact. And so we want to be, just thoughtful about those things and be very deliberate about it.
Love that response. And I know we're almost out of time, but man, we could talk about this for another hour, right? But I'm gonna give you one last thing. Like, if you could say one last thing to a person who's wrestling with, having these conversations at their church or in their context, given what already has been said and just your personal experience, like, what would be your encouragement to them as they prepare to either maybe take this to their lead pastor to do it, or maybe there's some lead pastors who are on, or maybe they're youth pastors who are trying to figure out how to do it with their youth group, or maybe somebody in the business world, and they're like, what, our business needs to be having this conversation. Our nonprofit needs to be having this conversation. I was just meeting with a parachurch leader this week, and she was saying this, man, my team needs to be having this conversation. So what would you say, given your area of experience, as kind of a closing statement to anyone who's wrestling with that?
To offer as, I guess, encouragement, be patient and do the best you can to remove any, prior filters or agendas that you may have, and do all you can to be intentional. I think it's going to take a lot of intentionality, and I think for us, what has happened is we've allowed the relationships to develop in a very organic way, and we've given each other I guess we've allowed everyone to know that we're probably going to offend each other, but the relationship is more important than the cause. So we're going to stick together no matter what.
Go the distance to answer the why first. Otherwise, I'm thinking especially about homogenous churches. Like if you have an all-white church, for example, take the time to answer the why first and thoroughly. Otherwise, the conversation is an irritant to people who haven't really gotten on board yet.
To just keep being intentional, love them where they are, but kind of push it with love, because I think sometimes you're going to get frustrated because you want to get them on board and they're not jumping yet, but it's going to take a little time. Just be patient, keep praying, and God is going to honor those prayers.
Pastors and probably lots of Christian leaders, for that matter, are pretty famous for asking people that they're leading to do something that they themselves are not doing. Whether it's, hey, go out and share the gospel with somebody, or be generous and give with your finances, or dedicate yourself to prayer. But the reality is that we lead best when we only call people to doing things that we ourselves are first engaging in ourselves. And so, if we believe this is true, if we believe this is important, then we need to be doing it ourselves. And I believe that as we do that, and because it is true, when people see that, it's going to be powerful, and they're going to want to know more about it. And so we need to lead by example, and then just simply invite others into it. It needs to not be so much a whip, a challenge, as it is an invitation to something that God is in. And it's an invitation to being a part of what all history is leading to. That is every tribe, tongue, and nation gathered around the throne of Jesus, worshiping him as one. And so we're inviting people into something that's beautiful. And that's what I would leave us with.
One of the things here is I've had that tension of being frustrated at the slowness. And what I've had to do is celebrate the small steps, embracing those and realizing that's God at work, even if it's not happening as fast as I'd like. Be patient and celebrate even small conversations.
Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to all of you who are on. Really excited about this conversation. And just to let you know, something I'll share real quickly before we end. I love the way Kim Gladden, our discipleship director, says it this way. Like, there are a lot of different ways you can teach people to do things. One, for example, you could throw them in the deep end, right? Of like a pool, right? You just throw them in and hopefully they learn how to swim. We don't highly recommend that, although that's sometimes what people do. You could methodically, if they're teaching them to swim, for example, you could teach them, the strokes and things of that nature, and all of the things that come with that. But then there's another way that you draw people, and that is just to simply get in the pool and have fun, right? And just the energy and the excitement of teaching someone else to swim, the energy around that, people want to learn to swim themselves. And so as you think about your context, I hope is one of those last two, right? And especially the third, that it is an exciting journey. It's a difficult journey, but it's definitely worth it as you have these conversations. And as Elizabeth said, that you have them in a sustainable way. So just in terms of next steps for us, we're taking a little bit of time off for the rest of April. There are some pretty important things happening in April that might consume a little bit of your time, things like Easter and Exponential. And so we're going to take some time off. We're going to resume in May. Our plan is to have a multi-ethnic women roundtable. We're also going to have a session on community engagement strategies, like how do we take CCDA models, Christian Community Development Association models, and make those applicable into our context. And then we're also going to talk about first and second generation ministry. How do you do bilingual ministry? And so those are three conversations we're hoping to have in May. And hopefully you'll be able to jump in and be a part of one of those. But thank you so much for being a part. Josemar, would you quickly just close us out in prayer, and we'll see you all next time.
Amado Señor, Padre, te damos gracias por este día, te damos gracias por cada persona que está aquí en este panel. Y gracias también por cada persona que estuvo escuchando. Gracias, Señor, porque eres tú quien nos lleva, Padre, quien tenemos el amor, Señor, para ti y para llegar a los corazones de otras personas. Te pido, Señor, que seas tú con cada persona que tú usas preguntas, que se sientan, Señor, que los estás ayudando, Padre, que quites las frustraciones de sus corazones, Señor, pero que celebren las poquitas cosas que están pasando en tu iglesia, Señor, y que seas tú hablándoles y que es a tu tiempo, Señor, para tu honra, para tu gloria, Señor. Te amamos. Amén.
Amen. Amen. So, hey, we want you to continue to celebrate every time a disciple makes a disciple and every time a church multiplies itself until the Wesleyan Church has a transforming presence in every zip code. And we believe that for every denomination. So God bless you all. We'll see you next time.